Hello, sir.
All right, welcome.
Yeah, I'm audible enough.
Yeah, you are. You are.
Okay. A question. So,
Osheon.
yesterday during the conversation, we were discussing about Oduduwa and him being the father of Yorubas. So he asked questions about, are there kings in Yorùbáland before Oduduwa was born?
Should I begin to answer it straight like this? Can you just ask
No,
as you're
I'm,
asking?
I'm
So the
going
man
back
down
to.
there.
I'm,
Okay,
no,
Jema
I'm going
calling
back to
guy.
work. So let me kiss you. Yeah.
Nisuru. Okay. Were there kings in Yoruba before Oduduwa? Were there kings in Yoruba land? Abi?
Yeah. Well, before Oduduwa was born. Yes.
Okay.
So if yes, how come? If yes, how come our what's it called? Our history starts from Oduduwa. Because I think most of the Yorubas agree that most of the Yorubas on that platform agree that there were kings in maybe in Ijebu or Ugbo, Olugbo of Ugbo or something named.
There was nothing like
Very sure
Olugbo.
they didn't get
There was
the
nothing
history
like
very
Olugbo,
well.
but there was nothing like Olugbo,
Okay.
but please continue. Mongbo.
So
Is that all? Is that all?
also he went further that no, that's not all. That's not all.
Okay.
So he also said that Oduduwa, because according to Samuel Ajayi Crowther and Samuel Johnson, that they wrote that Oduduwa
Someone Ajayi
came
Crowther.
from Sudan.
Neither of them
Ajayi
actually
Crowther and
wrote.
Samuel Johnson.
Neither of them said anything about Sudan in connection with Oduduwa. What's it going more? You know what?
Then lastly,
I'm
he
going
now
to bring
said
out a book.
Oduduwa was a Odudu. Okay.
Mongbo.
So and lastly, he said Oduduwa was a conqueror. He was conquering all the Yoruba kings, forcing them to be their own, forcing them for him to be their own lord or something like that. Not the JB Olori, something like that. So that was what they were discussing throughout yesterday. And
Okay. Mongbo. All right, I'm going to mute you now. Okay, thank you. Sudan, Libyan. Let me see. So I'm thinking, what book I should go? Should I go up, stand up now? I think we just continue. I think if I have to stand up and pick up any book, I think I have a couple of books here. But if I have to stand up at any point, I will let you know. So where do we even begin? All right, Mumbo. So let me see the questions again. Were there kings in Yorùbáland before Oduduwa? The answer is yes. Were there kings in Yorùbáland before Oduduwa? The answer is yes. All the titles you are mentioning, Olugbo, Ojale, there was nothing like that. All those titles came much later. So I think the best way to understand that question is to understand the space where Oduduwa became king. Let's start with let's try and understand what Ife itself was like. Were there kings in Yorùbáland before Oduduwa? The answer is yes. Was there a king of Ife before Yorùbá? The answer is no. All right. Now to get to this, we also first have to understand what Ife looked like back then. You see, Ife had this interesting. It still does have this interesting topography. It's like, and this is what scholars, would say whenever especially archaeologists, whenever they describe the topography of Ife, it's like a bowl, right? There's a depression, and then you have a rim, and then you have the hills. Now, inside that depression, there is a swamp, which of course archaeologists, posit that it's like it shows you a sign that there used to be a body of water in that particular place, but it dried out over time. Now, but while it was still Guinea, there was a swamp, all right, and it was populated by a particular group of people. Those group of people that are in that particular area are called the Igbo or Ugbo. That part of the places where they were. They were fishermen, they were foragers. Now, on the rim, you have communities. Those communities in Ife at the time, they were called Elu. In our songs in Ife today, you hear, if for instance you know Drojayaremo, you Kwadamo, you hear Ife Mefa, Elu Meje, talks to the 13 communities that were called the Elu at the time, or Elu. Those 13 communities were in that rim. All right, so you have like a depression. Inside there, you have a swamp. Around that place, people are living there. That place is called the Ugbo. The Igbo people live in that space. You come to the rim, and then you have the 13 communities. There's Omologun, Parakin, Okioja, Iloran, Odin, Ideta, Iloromu, Iwerin, Okeawo, Ijugbe, Iraye, Imojubi, and Ido. Those 13 communities had kings. Whenever you hear in Nigeria of autonomous communities, have you heard that thing before? I want to make sure that we are together. Have you heard the phrase autonomous communities? Has anybody heard of that word before? You heard it's very popular in a particular part of Nigeria, autonomous communities. You heard it before? Okay, you heard it before? Okay. So, all those 13 communities were autonomous, right? There was nobody ruling everybody. Each group had its own king, all right? And for instance, Ijugbe had a king called Obalejugbe. Interesting, when I was younger, I had an uncle who used to stay at Ijugbe, and so we'll go there, and I was very small. We'll go there and greet him, but that name just stuck. Each of them also had different deities. It was so interesting that Ijugbe had the biggest yams in Ife at the time. I'm talking BC. Had the biggest yams. People now decided, for some interesting reason, to adopt their deity for productivity. Of course, much later, it's possibly, and this is what archaeologists have also said, that it's possible because of the soil quality and stuff, but it had better produce as far as yams were concerned. Now, each of them had their kings, each of them had their deities, and they were different, but they were all in the same place. This is what I always tell people about this idea of religion in Yorùbáland. We never really had just one deity for a place and say, oh, we have one religion. Yoruba has always had multiplicity of deities. It's in our history, and it's not, I'm not talking about 100, 500, 1,000 years. I'm talking from Igbalai. Whatever you know as the spirituality that we have today, it is dated. But I may not talk about it, but let's just get back into this. So 13 communities, everyone had their own kings, they had their own deities, they had a way of doing things. But at a particular point in history, they came together and said, you know what? You have your own kingdom, you're a king there, you're a king there, but we need to take advantage of the resources around us. So why not have this thing where the 13 of us can come together, and then we can appoint a person to lead us? Now, not the 13 communities, the 13 kings. So the communities remained autonomous, but the kings now had a sort of confederacy, and the leadership of that confederacy will be rotational. So think of it like a confederacy where each unit still retains its autonomy, but when it comes to certain things that involves all of us, we can work together based on the person who is the chairman at the time. The chairman is not the king of Ife, he is the head of the kings. Whenever they are, and he has a term. His term basically is until he dies. Actually, he's always the eldest. The oldest amongst them will be the king, right? So the oldest person will be the head, not the king, will be the head of those kings. In our history, the first person who turned out to be the first chairman of the Confederacy was the man called Oramfe. Of course, his deity now is worshipped now and is venerated. Oramfe Olena, who is also a deity today in Ife. Oramfe was the very first. There is a song, Toman Konfe, Ora Lonife. Wait, don't let me sing everything. The point is, what I want to bring out is just Ora Lonife, Ora Loloki, Ora Lonile. The idea is that he is now the one that everybody has to submit to, or at least the kings have to submit to. Not that he was the king of the town, but he was the head of the kings. And so every time the head Tobati Waja, the next oldest person will become the head. And that went on for many, many years. Now, Oramfe himself is from a part of Ife called Okiora. So I mentioned earlier that there's a depression in the bowl where you have the Igbo people. There's a rim where you have the 13 settlements. Then there is the hills. There are 7 hills surrounding Ife. One of those hills is called Okiora. Oramfe is from that hill. Interestingly, Oduduwa is also from that hill. It's eastward of the main bowl, of the main side of Ife, but it's in Ife, right? So think of it like city center, but you still have the city. So you have the depression, you have the rim, and then you have the hills. Oramfe was from Okiora, just like Oduduwa, much later. Again, not the same timeline, many centuries apart. Okay? So Oramfe became the first head of all the kings, and then they had many, leaders and elders and chairmen, that's the word, chairman of the Confederacy. The very last chairman was Obatala. At the time, he was a king of Ideta. He was not the king of Ife. There was no king of Ife. And I've heard one person say, like, his father's father used to be the king of Ife before Oduduwa. Is a lie. There was never any king of Ife. Yoruba had not developed the idea of uniting communities and building a capital like Oduduwa did. He was the first, which is why we call him our father. But I'll get to that later. Now you had all these, kings, but each community can determine who will be their king because it's their right, it's their own space, and everybody knows their boundaries, but we can work together. That's why I said this idea of unity, we've practiced it for a very long time in Yorùbáland. Now, by the time of Obatala, there were certain things going on in Ife. We may not get into it today. Certain things going on today in Ife at the time. Certain people had some issues with the way leadership was at the time. They found some they were disillusioned with the kind of leadership that they had at the time. There were some frailties from the leader at the time. There are certain things that were not just very cool. Some, of course, were still loyal to him. Some wanted to change. In comes Oduduwa, not from Mecca, not from Sudan. By the way, excuse me, people lie a lot. Ajayi Crowther did not write about Oduduwa's history. The person who wrote Yoruba history and mentioned Oduduwa is Samuel Johnson, and he published his book in 1921. That book is inside, but I can't stand up to go and read it now. A History of the Yoruba People. It was published in 1921. Not once was Sudan even brought up. What was brought up was not even his own theory. The idea of an Arabic origin and stuff like that was not even from him as a person. It was from another. It was quoting someone else. Who was he quoting? He was quoting Sultan Bello, Ahmadu Bello's grandfather, a direct descendant of Usman Dan Fodio, who was in his own mind writing stuff about where he thinks Yoruba people must have come from. But again, we'll get to that later. That's not the exact answer to the question you're asking. If we have to, I will get into what Sultan Bello actually said and what Samuel Johnson wrote. Right? And by the way, I think people assume that if two people have Samuel in their names, then that means that both of them wrote the same books. So that's tell you the kind of people that are talking all these things. So Samuel Johnson wrote that. By the way, Samuel Johnson himself is from Oyo. He's a Yoruba man. So don't he took that name, of course, because he had returned from Sierra Leone, and that was where he got his name. Okay. Now, where was I? Obatala was the one leading at the time. People were already clamoring for change. Oduduwa gets in the mix, not from abroad. He's from that place. And by the way, as I'm talking, I've already mentioned one book. By the way, that book is very good, apart from the bits that have to do with history, because, you know, the problem with that book, as far as origins of Yoruba is concerned, is that it's everywhere, and so it's difficult to pin it down. But it's still a very, very important book. Once you move past that particular, thing, if you ever want to review the book, I will explain in details. But you can still read the book by Stephen Banji Akitoye, A History of the Yoruba, and also a book by Akinwumi Ogundiran, Yoruba, The New History. You can also read Cradle of a Race by Adema Kinwa. Then there's another book on Ife by Akin Jogbe. Anyway, around that time, people were already clamoring for change. Here comes Oduduwa, part of this people there, but of course not a king. I mean, at least not one of the 13 heads. Was known to be something, even in Okiora. And Okiora is not a recent creation. It was the same place where Oramfe came from. Okay? He comes around and says, we've got to change this whole structure. This is not helping. There are some details I will not get into right now. Like this is not helping. There's times change, right? And then as times change, sometimes it might require a change in political structure. And so what he said was that instead of having 13 settlements with kings, they could band everybody together. Anyway, his own ideas led to a fight. Was there a war between Oduduwa and Obatala? Some Yoruba will say no, because they don't want to sound like Oduduwa fought. There was a war, and it was not bang bang bang. Okay, at Parija. No, it was physical. There were weapons involved. There were sackings involved. Some of the heads of those 13 communities were on the side of Oduduwa. Some were on the side of Obatala, and eventually they were able to push Obatala out. Obatala was not the leader of Ife. He was the leader of the kings of the 13 settlements. His own settlement was called Ideta. When the war became fierce, he was pushed out of Ideta and he established a place called Ideta Oko, which tells you that Ideta Ile, apparently. Some people call it Ideta, some people call it Idita. It's the same thing. Ife, sometimes we have different ways of saying the same thing. While he was there was a prince called Prince Ojumu. He brokered peace. By the way, before that, there was a problem in Ideta Oko. There was a smallpox epidemic, right? Affected a lot of people. So they had to broker peace. When they brokered, Prince Ojumu got in the mix, they brokered peace. And they had to come with a new way of, okay, so if you ban all the settlements together now, you're going to become the king of Ife. As a matter of fact, that's exactly how Oduduwa became the king of Ife. He banded the 13 communities together and became the king of everyone. That had not happened before anywhere in Yorùbáland. Before him, there were kings in Yorùbáland, but it was an idea of autonomous communities, not so big. What Oduduwa did in the 11th century is the exact same thing you see all across Yorùbáland. Whether you go to Ondo, you go to Ijebu, you go to Oyo, you go to even Egba, with a little twist in Egba, is the same structure you find everywhere. It was not the first king, but it was the first king that will be known as a divine king. So you see, everybody on earth becomes, before him, you become a deity after you are gone. For the Oni, he is not going to have to waja to become an Orisha. He is divine from the very word go. That's why it's called Oni Risha. For instance, even the first class, the big kings in Yorùbáland are known as Aláṣẹ Èkejì Òrìṣà. Oni is not Aláṣẹ Èkejì Òrìṣà. Oni is Onírìṣà. He is a deity. Okay? That concept of divine kingship did not exist in Yorùbáland until that moment. Also, the idea of banding different communities together did not happen before that moment. The fact that he was able to do something that we had never seen before made it, I mean, like, so, you know how you have BC and AD, before Christ and in the year of our Lord, Anno Domini. It's not like there was no world before Jesus was born, but his life was so important, that also significant, that it marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. When we call Oduduwa our father, it's not like, oh, there was no other, and I'm going to go to the spiritual aspect. I know there's a spiritual aspect of creation with Oduduwa and everything. That's not what we're talking about now. So there's the myth, there's the history. What I'm talking to you right now is the history. The myth is also valid, but the myth explains something totally different. But that's not where we're going right now. So if you have that thing, oh, how about they said that Oduduwa was the first person that came to the earth? That's the myth of our origin. That's different from the history. And if we have to get to it, we'll get to it. Now the point is that because he was so significant, and his influence, you can't even say was, he's such a significant figure in our history. When we want to discuss our history, we say things that happened before him and after him, just like we will say before Christ and after Christ. For example, if I have to ask you, let me ask you a question right now. Who is the father of modern Yoruba people? I'm not giving you multiple choice or anything. If you just write whatever answer you think. Who is the father of modern Yoruba people? Awo. People are writing Awo. Are you sure? Really? Awo. So the question is this: was Awo the first Yoruba man? The idea of Awolowo being our father today is not a biological fact. It's a historical and ideological fact. It's not about did he give birth to all of us. No, we are here because he came. If you are discussing the history of Yorùbáland today, I'm not saying he was even the wisest that ever lived. That's not the point. The point is that he's so significant that as far as Yoruba history is concerned, in the last 100, 150 years, impact was is so significant that we still feel him. And I remember I say it every time. If we were living in the 14th or 15th century, there would be a shrine to Awo today. But of course, we don't have any shrine to him, but we can call him father, especially in the context of Nigeria. That's exactly how Oduduwa was back then. There were people before him. There were kings before him, but there was no king like him. Nobody ever did what he did. He created a structure that nobody ever saw, where these communities now do not have to say he said, come together, we're going to create a new city. There's a city center, there's a town hall, there's a palace, there's a marketplace. So you essentially have a new downtown. Then they now allocated places in Ilugogon, in the city center, Tonko, and now say, okay, that let's say for instance, Iloromu, here to here, that is your own in this place. And here to here, that is your own. You, that is your own. You, that is your own. So where they used to be before, they still owned it, but they now call those places Oko. If you grew up in Yorùbáland, you would probably have heard your parents say, or maybe your elders say things like, "I want losi gboro." The concept of Igboro for us is like you are going to the city, you are going to town. If you went to Ife or you, that's how the conductors, that's how the perosoko, they are going to town. Where they were before the new arrangement, they still owned it. And it's some of those places that you hear they now call Oko Waju or Oko Etile or Oko Egan. Oko Etile will be the farms around you where you can grow your vegetables, right? You can just plant some things and all of that. No big deal. Oko Waju is where you have to go further. In many cases, Oko Waju is where people used to be. They never left the place, to be honest, but it's like they can come to town, but they can also live in the farm. That farm used to be their home, but it's still their home, but they have another home in the city. So most of my grandparents, for instance, my granddad, for instance, of course, we have a place in town in Ife, but our Oko is so far away from that place, but it's still ours. That same thing is what you notice in just about every Yoruba story. When Ebumawe and Osemawe, the people who became Ebumawe and Osemawe, when they got into their spaces, for instance, they were twins. One was a lady, the other was a man. Ebumawe, the one who became the Ebumawe of Agoewoye. By the way, Ebumawe and Ondo are connected. Sorry, Agoewoye and Ondo are connected. Ebumawe was the twin, the brother, who became the king of Agoewoye. The sister, Osemawe, was the one who became the king of, and I'm using king intentionally, of Ondo. By the way, when you hear the word, I could have said queen, but the reason I said king is because, for the most part, when we hear queen, most times we think of consort. So there are 3 types of queens. Oh boy, I'm out of the topic, but it's still part of it. So there are 3. So there's queen dowager, there's queen consort, and then there's queen regnant. So the queen regnant is the queen that's like a king. For instance, Queen Elizabeth was queen regnant, but Queen Camilla is queen consort. She's a queen because she's married to the king, but Elizabeth was a queen who was reigning. So the reigning queen is the queen regnant. So the Osemawe was queen regnant, or a king, right? She was the one reigning. What they usually do is this. So when they got there, the place was not empty. There were people, but just like in Ife, they were small communities. So what they did was exactly what their forefather did. He banded them together, and in some cases, whenever you were told that, oh, people are coming from Ife. For instance, there was a particular period in Yoruba history where there was a lot of royal migration from Ife. There was a lot of royal migration from out of Ife. Princes traveled out. For instance, in the 13th century, in the 12th century, when Oromiyo moved to Benin, that was a royal migration. He spent 2 years in Benin, and then we didn't really enter the town. It was, but that area now, everywhere is Benin. Spent 2 years there, then went to Oyo. When he moved, it was around the same time, 12th, 13th century, that period between 12th and 14th century, a lot of princes moved out of Ife, a lot. Whether you're talking about Jibogun of Ilesha, Oromiyo himself, Ogunfunminire, Awori, most of those people moved around that period. I'm not giving you exact, I'm saying there was an era of royal migrations. When they moved out, sometimes they will find bare spaces and then they just establish their own settlements. In some cases, they will find occupied spaces. But you see, let me give you a very interesting example. Let's assume that they're living in Ife. Now, Ife has Shokbason happened shortly around the time of Oduduwa. Shokbason was one who went to Ketu. But you're right, he also moved out. Thank you, please focus. Now, let me even tell you, before I moved, let me not go too fast. After Oduduwa created the city, of course, there was a city center, there was a market, there was the palace, and then you have allocations of lands to people to build stuff. Around that time, he also built city wall around Ife. Depending on the timeline, you could even say, to be honest, he actually began to build even before the end of the old war. I know I'm rushing, but I think it's not right that I'm rushing. So let me slow down a bit. When he took over the entire place, let me tell you one of the things they did in Ife. I don't want to rush. I think it's not necessary. Let's take it one by one. When he took over the entire thing and became the king, I mean, before him there was something called, like I said, the chairman of the Confederacy. So that chairman was the primus inter pares. Is the first among equals. Oduduwa was not the first among equals. Oduduwa was a divine king. But despite the fact that he was now going to be the divine king and the unifier of all the 13 communities, Ife still had to do something to ensure that he did not have absolute powers. Because we don't like the idea of tyrants. Right? So what did they do? They created a structure that allowed for him to be the executive. But they have to have a cabinet, which will be the legislature, and then they have to have the judiciary. The legislature is called the Warefa. Right? They are chiefs. But they work together to make laws for the land. And then the judiciary is called Ogboni. Now, I know that you probably hear Ogboni in this and hear secret court. Well, that was not the origin. It wasn't just secret court. It was the judicial arm of government back in Ife. And then they had an arrangement also with the king. That arrangement is called Esisun. There were conventions, things he could do, things he could not do. He never had absolute powers, but he was lifted above every other deity, as a matter of fact. Now, that structure that you see in Ife is the exact same thing you see replicated everywhere. For instance, when you go to Oyo, what Oni is in Ife is what Alaafin is in Oyo. But Alaafin, of course, the first Alaafin will be Oromiyo himself, who eventually, after leaving Benin, went to Oyo, created the same thing in Oyo. The same structure his grandfather created in Ife, by the way. Oromiyo is Oduduwa's grandson. Created the same structure that his father created in Ife, and then brought in the same everything. So, for instance, the Oba, when Oromiyo got to Oyo, there were also settlements in Oyo. There were settlements in Oyo, but there was no Oyo like everybody. He brought all those settlements together, and a couple of those settlements were not even Yoruba. In the established, oh boy. Guys, we are very complex people and it's lovely. In establishing Oyo, there were Nupe elements, there were Bariba elements from the very beginning. They were in the minority, but they were seen. As a matter of fact, they had representation in parliament, in their own council. Their own king, of course, would be Alaafin, but their own Iwarefa is not Iwarefa, it's Oyomesi. It's the exact same thing as what you have in Ife. They have a Bashorun, just like Ife has an Obalufe, who is the prime minister in Ife. By the way, he's still there today. There's an Obalufe right now. So you have Oni, you have Obalufe, who is the prime minister. You have the Warefa, you have the Ogboni. So you have Alaafin, you have Bashorun, you have Oyomesi, then you have Ogboni in Oyo. When you, by the way, I want to allow you missing. They have different names. There's Bashorun, there's Alakbini, and so on and so forth. That same structure is in Ijebu. Ogboni in Ijebu is what you call Oshugbo. It's the same thing. And of course, they also have their own structure. Now, each of them, Ashepa, thank you. Each of those groups also have their own structures. So the king has his own structure. The Warefa, that's the cabinet is working with. When you now go into the Ogboni now have their own structure. So let's say Oyomesi, for instance. In Oyomesi, you see Alakbini, you see Ashipa, you see Bashorun, you see the rest of them. Those ones, they have a way they run their stuff. The Ogboni now have their own thing as well. They have Yabiye and their chiefs, and the way they have their rituals, the way they do their stuff and things like that. The point is that Samu, thank you, please focus. Samu or Samu. That's in Oyo. Agba, thank you. So what you see essentially is a replication of a structure, which is why it nauseates me when people are trying to say, "Oh, you're Eskinikan, if Eskinikan, it doesn't make sense. The very foundation of this place was from a man who was a grandson of the person who created that place and replicated it in this place. What is the ego trip about? If you like, you can build your house to reach the skies. You can never become bigger than your father. As far as the timelines are concerned, he got here before you. Anything that makes you tell you that anything that makes you, oh, I'm now bigger because I became something. By the way, the empire that Oyo became, Oyo was not the first empire in Yorùbáland. Ife was the first empire. Oyo was an empire for 200 years, which was fantastic. But Ife was an empire for 400 years. And I know it, I also hear people say it's the spiritual headquarters. Ife is not it's not just the spiritual headquarters of Yoruba people. It's also the cultural and political headquarters of Yoruba people. Oyo is the political headquarters of Oyo Empire. They are two different things. Ife is not the spiritual headquarters. Oyo is political kingdom. No. Ife is the spiritual headquarters of Yoruba people, the cultural headquarters, the political headquarters. It's all of those things. Oyo is the headquarters of the Oyo Empire, which was huge and powerful. But guess what? It wasn't even every part of Yorùbáland that was part of Oyo Empire, to be clear. But majority of Yoruba, everywhere you go, they'll tell you back to Ife. Now, why do they mention Ife? Because the kind of structure they were having was, so you have, during the royal migrations, people moving with the structure, the ideology, even the religion. Let me find a way to say it in a way that people will not go crazy.